Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Start in 3 minutes. How bad is the echo? There should be like the green, isn't it like a green plus sign that you can enlarge the screen? All right, we'll start in, actually, screw it, let's just get started now. So one at a time, I'll probably say 35 times tonight, if not more. Let's go one at a time, just type your questions. I'll answer them, some may be longer, some may be shorter responses, but who wants to start? Okay, period 3. Well, that's the post-classical period. I'd say that the spread of Islam is enormously important in period 3. There's always questions about the spread of Islam. And traditionally speaking, I would say like the spread of Islam comes into different categories. So on the most recent test, there was a question about diaspora communities. As Islam spread throughout the Middle East, it went into North Africa, it went into Spain and Portugal, but also remember Islam spread predominantly through Southeast Asia. So Islam spread is a huge theme, and as Islam spread across the world, the merchants and the missionaries set up new communities in that area, in the respective areas. So with Islam, you have trade. That's one of the main reasons it spread. You have missionaries, the Sufi missionaries, Sufism. I think that was a question a lot of you got tripped up on. But certainly the diaspora theme is a really important concept. Now, I'll just deviate real quick from period 3 because I saw another question come up about Jewish diasporas, which I think that's one of my former Chandler students, Epic Guy 2005. I don't remember who that is, but for all the basis Chandler kids, big shout out. So diaspora is the spread of peoples all over the world that form new communities. The Jewish people traditionally didn't have a home country until after World War II with the creation of Israel. So the diaspora communities are sets of people beyond their homeland. That's the idea of a diaspora. But back to period 3, I think another huge topic within period 3 is the growth of empire building. You have new empires emerging after the fall of the Roman Empire. Europe was fractured for the most part, but then you have the Byzantine Empire. You've got also in period 3, you've got the growth of trade routes connecting different parts of Afro-Eurasia. But I think a huge period 3 topic is the Mongols. The Mongols always seem to come up. There's no way you can avoid the Mongols on this test. You know, their influence on world history is just incredible. The spread of the Mongols across Africa, or across Eurasia, they didn't go to Africa, and the influence of the Mongols are a really big period 3 topic. And then the beginning of the Renaissance too took place in period 3. So you've got the emergence of the Renaissance, you have the Middle Ages in Europe, the Crusades. I mean, man, it's just all over the place. Age of Enlightenment was period 4. So the Enlightenment took place kind of like late 1600s, early 1700s. The Byzantine Empire and the Mongol Empire did not come into conflict that often, no. The Mongols went as far west as like the Ukraine, so they were into Eastern Europe, but they didn't really tangle with the Byzantine Empire. Orthodox Christianity its home base was in the Byzantine Empire. It was in the Byzantine Empire. And so if you think about where the Byzantine Empire's roots were, the Byzantine Empire was in the Balkans region, like Greece, Turkey. Turkey was actually like the home country of the Ottoman Empire. I'm sorry, the Ottoman Empire, but also the Byzantine Empire as well. But Orthodox Christianity spread predominantly into Russia. It really went into Russia and had a big influence on the Slavic peoples in Russia. I would say Eastern Europe, Balkans, Russia. Russia during the Renaissance, Russia fell behind a little bit. Russia wasn't really very involved with the Renaissance at all. And that was one of the reasons why Peter the Great's impact on Russia was so important, because Peter the Great sort of brought Russia up to speed. He kind of helped Russia catch up in the 1600s. So the Renaissance didn't really impact Russia all that much. The Protestant Reformations, well, it all started with Martin Luther, and he challenged the Catholic Church, some of the Catholic Church policies, especially the sale of indulgences. And Luther basically wrote arguments as to why the Catholic Church was corrupt. And as a result of that, he ignited a fury of anti-Catholic Church response. I think that one of the things you always want to keep in mind about the Protestant Reformation is that it raises the question of sectarianism. And sectarianism is when you have that rigid, intense divide between two different groups. Usually sectarian rivalries include religious groups or ethnic groups, but Protestant Catholics really, that division started with Martin Luther. But over time, what emerged with one man's sort of challenging the church's policies eventually went into a matter of almost a global growth of Christianity. So Christianity really emerged as the dominant world religion because now you had two different groups spreading it, and you have all the divisions of Protestant and Catholics that emerged around the world. The Protestant Reformation is one of the great sectarian examples of all time, really. And so, one of the things to keep in mind too is as the Europeans spread across during the age of exploration, that's really when the Protestant Reformation started to have a global impact, because the British, for example, which converted to Protestantism, as they built their North American colonies, they brought Protestantism with them. The Dutch, where they colonized, they brought Protestantism, whereas Spain and France and Portugal, they were the big Catholic countries, so they brought Catholicism into their colonies. And that's really where the Protestant Reformation began to have like a global effect, much more beyond Europe. Ethan's question, how did the Japanese recover from World War II? So the United States took serious ownership and really sort of enforced its policies upon Japan during World War II, after World War II. The US built military bases, and it really kind of put Japan in a stranglehold. And as a result of the United States' influence in Japan after World War II, the United States definitely assisted Japan's economic revolution. The Japanese miracle, I mentioned it on the sneaky topics. I kind of put that in there. The Japanese miracle occurred after World War II, when the Japanese began to really promote its economy through the building up of electronics, cars, and really it's just a matter of the Japanese had nothing else going on but to invest their entire population into their economic revival. And they became one of the super economic powers in Asia as after World War II. So it's a remarkable turnaround. Cyrus the Great was a Persian emperor. He afforded religious toleration throughout his empire. That was one of the reasons we talked about him. And he was a good example of, in the classical period, an emperor who used toleration. You guys have seen questions about how empires maintain power. This is a pretty common question. So Cyrus the Great helped maintain power by granting toleration. He showed that you can be a tolerant leader without it becoming a detriment to your empire's authority. And the Persians were a good example of one of the first classical empires that divided their power up into different groups. They had those satraps that were local leaders, and Cyrus kind of pioneered that style of leadership where you kind of delegate your authority out to local leaders, and in turn, that sort of built this network of trust within the main ruling power and the local leaders as well. All right, if you guys could please slow down, and also I'm gonna. I don't know who this person is, but I'm warning this. Okay, fine. A couple of these comments you're pretty close to getting tossed. I would really appreciate if people allowed me to keep this going. Okay, and also this needs to like slow down. You guys are just typing to type. I cannot keep up with this. There's just way too many questions. So please stop typing questions. I'm going to say this right now. Please stop typing questions. Let me catch up. Okay, Alexander the Great was Macedonian. He built he expanded the Macedonian Empire, and this became known as the Hellenistic Empire because Alexander the Great was responsible for spreading Greek culture all throughout his empire. Let's see. Also, if you guys could be more specific, like, it would help. The Enlightenment was more or less a movement, an intellectual, a political, a social movement where ideas about natural rights were really prominent. The Enlightenment came in response to years of absolutism. Absolute monarchies controlled all the power within Europe. The Enlightenment came directly from Europe, and as a result of the Enlightenment, you have major changes going on throughout Europe. You've got the growth of new political systems. You've got the revolutions that occurred in countries like England and France. So the Enlightenment was really a big theme of the Enlightenment. A big theme of the Enlightenment was changing government. You know, people began to question government, and they began to overturn government with new ideas. Some of the ideas were, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, more democratic ideals. But I would say liberalism, is another big theme of the Enlightenment. But you can't think of the Enlightenment without thinking about revolution. The Enlightenment inspired revolutions in America. It inspired revolutions in France. It inspired revolutions in England. It inspired revolutions in the Caribbean, like the Haitian Revolution. It inspired revolutions in South America as well. And there always seems to be questions about the Enlightenment's impact there. And Mexico as well. The Mexican Revolution was an Enlightenment-inspired revolution. So now with the Enlightenment, there's always the potential to get some of the key Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who had the idea of natural rights, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire. I mean, we did a little activity there, but I think the Enlightenment, you just want to sort of position that as this major 1700s, period 4 topic. Also, keep in mind with the Enlightenment, you also have the growth of capitalism. That was another idea that came from Adam Smith within the context of the Enlightenment. So just sweeping changes all across the globe during the Enlightenment era. The Gunpowder empires, there were 3 Muslim empires, Gunpowder empires. They conquered land with advanced military technology. All 3 were originally Central Asian groups, Central Asian nomadic groups that, remember, Central Asia, I always say don't sleep on Central Asia. The Central Asian nomads spread Islam widely throughout Central Asia. They came in off the plains of Central Asia, the steppes. And the 3 big ones were the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, which was set up in Turkey, and then you had the Safavid Empire in Persia. The long-term effect of the Gunpowder empires is we sort of looked at it as like a form of Islamic Renaissance. This was a rebirth of Islam, sort of an affirmation of Islam throughout the Middle East, throughout South Asia, right? Islam becoming the majority the minority religion, but the ruling power in India. And so certainly the spread of the Gunpowder empires really cemented Islam's legacy in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire was a 500-year empire, and the Mughal Empire is a good example of how that set up all the tension that we talked about after World War II with the decolonization of India. What was some main effects in societies of native? Okay, so any question that deals with the peoples of the Americas, and you just have to remember when the Europeans arrived, it's more than just diseases, and that's the easy place to start. But the Europeans infused all their culture, their religion, their language on the native and African peoples that were brought to the New World. But certainly, a topic that does seem to come up a lot is how the native and the African peoples were brought to labor systems. And these labor systems took advantage. They manipulated and they took advantage of the African and native groups that were in the areas, whether it was the Spanish, the French, the British, you name it, the Dutch, Portuguese. They really took advantage of these peoples. And so the natives found themselves trapped in a way that they had no power anymore. Their empires had collapsed. Their trade networks were taken over, and they were forced to adopt the European customs or else try to fight against the Europeans, which in some cases the native groups did try to fight and resist, but that was more or less a futile effort that often didn't work out very well for the natives. And certainly for the African peoples, like their infusion offers plenty of syncretism. Examples, religion, music, culture, foods, language. I think that's one of the most important positive effects, if you can draw a positive out of everything that happened as a result of the Columbian Exchange. So certainly one of the direct effects of all that was syncretism. In what order in which South Africa? So South Africa was first settled by the Dutch, and then the British took over South Africa. They imperialized South Africa in the late 1800s due to I would say 3 reasons: gold, diamonds, and the railroads. Classical India, well, you're dealing with like the 2 main empires. You have the Mauryan Empire, which was Ashoka the Great. That was the Buddhist empire that really spread Buddhism and helped to make Buddhism one of the major world religions in the Mauryan Empire. And then you have the Gupta Empire, which is considered the golden age of India. The reestablishment of Hinduism as the main cultural linchpin in India. So the Gupta Empire really reinforced key tenets of Hinduism. Not that Buddhism faded away completely, but Buddhism spread and became more widely adopted in East Asia, like China, Korea, Japan. And And while there's still traces of Buddhism in India, certainly Buddhism found a lot of roots elsewhere in the world. The Song Dynasty was best known for, I would say, the growth of Confucianism and really strengthening China's civil service system. You know, the Song Dynasty was the dynasty that came right before the invasion of the Mongols. And the growth of Confucianism in the Song Dynasty really was a legacy that they left behind. China at this point had the world's largest cities. Its trade was immense. The tribute system as well, that's something to always keep in mind with the Chinese dynasties. And so the Song Dynasty really was a powerhouse trade. Technological growth during the Song Dynasty was immense. And so the Song Dynasty should always be remembered for the growth of Confucianism. It should be known for the growth of the tribute system, and also a good example of how China was a world leader in manufacturing. What are the causes and effects of the Creole revolutions and the Mexican Revolution? So the Creole revolutions took place during, that was part of like Simón Bolívar and Juan Morales' efforts in South America. Many of the Creoles who were the European, and they were the European blood born outside of Europe. So like if your parents came and settled in South America and you were European, so that was, that's what a Creole was. So the Creoles revolted against the Spanish. They felt that there was a divide that was impossible to overcome. And the Spanish empire was eventually toppled by these revolutions. The Mexican Revolution was similar in the sense that the Spanish were toppled, their empire fell apart, but ultimately, I would say one of the big differences was in Mexico, for example. I always go back to land redistribution, the idea that the Mexican peoples were redistributing the land, and ultimately, you know, that becomes a staple of revolutions in the 20th century, especially communist revolutions. But with the Creole revolutions in South America, it was mainly about trying to, I mean, the Enlightenment was the guiding principle. I mean, there was this idea that the Enlightenment was behind everything going on in these revolutions. And so the Enlightenment really inspired the Mexican peoples as well as South Americans to try to liberate themselves from the Spanish. And so I would always make sure to be aware of that. I would always make sure you guys are aware about that tie to the Enlightenment with those revolutions. All right. Okay, I'm trying to catch up here. There's so many. There's just so many comments here. This is. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to go through. I can't, I literally. am like so. This is very frustrating because I am trying to clean up here from a lot of people's garbage. Jason asked about the impact of smuggling. Smuggling was in direct response. This is a period 4 topic. Smuggling was in direct response to the strict navigation acts that countries like the UK passed as part of their mercantilist economies. Mercantilism was the idea that the motherland had complete and full control of their their colonies, and as a result of that, countries began to try to smuggle, and they tried to get goods that they couldn't normally receive, because the idea was that the British, for example, wanted their colonies' production and their goods to all go through England. They didn't want the French to be able to come in, and they didn't want the French to be able to, end up getting molasses or French wines and selling them for cheaper goods. So ultimately, smuggling was in direct response to the navigation acts and mercantilist policies. During, I'm seeing Quinn's question, China took over the Ming Dynasty. I'm sorry, the Sung Dynasty was ultimately the Sung Dynasty was conquered by the Ming, and then I'm sorry, geez, Louise, I'm sorry. The Sung Dynasty was conquered by the Mongols, and during the Mongol rule, the Chinese dynasty was known as the Yuan dynasty. The capitalist countries' response to communism was, it was various responses. You've got the creation of NATO, you've got the creation of all the Cold War tensions that existed around the world. And ultimately, that set up, that was one of the driving influences. I'm responding to Ethan's question. That was one of the driving influences by the various capitalist countries. The United States had the Marshall Plan, where they gave money to capitalist countries in Eastern and Western Europe to keep them away from communists. The United States had the domino theory, which determined that the United States would intervene to prevent the spread of communism. And so, ultimately, when it comes to I'm losing my train of thought because I'm almost just really trying to I'm getting so frustrated that people are taking this and completely making a mockery of it. So, I am not in any point required to do this. So if people can't respect this, it's just going to, and look, it is so easy for me to take a screenshot of everything. So if people want to keep on making these kind of comments, I'm just going to start screenshotting, and I have no problem. But that's my one warning, man. This is absolutely ridiculous. Key reasons for the global Great Depression. I'm responding to Millette's question. Key reasons for the global Great Depression. Post-World War I problems. World War I really wreaked havoc on Europe. It raised a whole lot of awareness about economic mishaps countries were very tied closely together economically, and when one country went down, they all went down. One of the big issues with World War I was rapid inflation. So after the war, countries' economies were so war-torn, they wound up falling into basically falling into incredible economic depressions. And this first started in Europe in the 1920s, and then eventually towards the end of the 20s, the United States wound up being in. All right, everyone's saying that there's static. I'll try to take the headphones out. Hopefully this is a little clearer to everybody. But anyways, the economic global depression eventually came over to the United States, and it wreaked havoc on the United States economy. But I would just say that mostly you're dealing with a situation where after World War I, the economies around the world were really hit hard by the effects of the war, and the war took its toll, not just in terms of lives lost, but also in terms of the economy. And that's where you get the arrival of the economists that I talked about, John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics was ultimately the idea that governments could recover from this economy governments could recover by the economy by overspending, by spending a lot more money than they had. And that was the idea of Keynesian economics. The Encomienda system was the use of native labor force. So that was the main difference with the African labor. Natives were first used a lot in mines, the silver mines of the Spanish Empire, and eventually the Spanish realized that the usage of natives was just they could not maintain. The natives were dying at too alarming a rate, so eventually the Encomienda system was canceled. Important names and events to remember about classical Greece. I think that, like with Greece, you've got the birth of democracy in Athens. You've got we looked at. I remember in the beginning of the year we read Pericles' speech, which was a great example of him talking about Athenian democracy. But the Athens v Sparta. I think with Greece, there's always that potential to get into like how Greece was, this bastion of like history and science and learning. And of course, you get with the antiquity that came from the Renaissance. It was that love of Greek and Roman culture that boosted the Renaissance. China after the Han. Well, after the Han Dynasty collapsed, China went through a period of like a serious power vacuum. And during the power vacuum that China was in, it ultimately wasn't stabilized again until the Sui Dynasty. The Sui Dynasty was in the 500s period. So the Han Dynasty collapsed. It was ultimately okay. Well, everyone's talking about this audio. I'll try headphones again. but I really can't. This is mostly, I think, a YouTube thing that I'm dealing with here. I'm just using YouTube Live, man. I'm up on my. I'm doing the best I can. So right now, I honestly, I'm very distracted because every time I keep looking, there are people that are commenting on all this, and it's truly like interfering with my train of thought. When the Mongols took over China, the Mongols instituted. They tried to scrub China of most of its reforms. Most of its culture. The Mongols wanted the Chinese to adopt the Mongol way of life, and I would say the biggest impact that the Mongols had during their time in charge of the Chinese is the fact that the Mongols reinstituted the Silk Road trade. That was one of the greatest. That was one of the greatest impacts the Mongols had over China. They really revitalized the Silk Road trade. The Mongols were more or less cultureless people. They didn't impart their culture on other empires, but they did try to take away other empires and other people's beliefs. So ultimately, I would say I think that one of the biggest impacts of the Mongols was the Silk Roads and unifying Eurasia under trade. Yeah, I'm just doing straight up on YouTube Live. I would say, in terms of empires scrubbing other people's cultures, I think that when you look at what happened with the Europeans, what they did in the Americas, they really tried to erase a lot of the native culture. A lot of the great works of art and architecture were destroyed. And so I think that that's a common theme, that when places are often conquered, their culture there's an attempt to wipe out the culture. I think that, the Mongols, one thing the Mongols were very good at is they adopted other people's cultures. And as a result of that, they were able to more or less continue with a lot of cultures. Like, for example, the Mongols adopted Persian culture, they adopted Islamic culture. And that really was a matter of their great legacy. But the Europeans, for example, they tried to wipe out a bunch of the culture of the places that they were conquering throughout the New World. Yeah, the Renaissance was period 3 and 4, to address Anina's question. And yes, the Mongols were definitely a part of the spread of the Black Plague. That came from China under the Mongol rule. The Warring States period was a gap before the Qin Dynasty, which came in the 200s CE. The Qin Dynasty was the first to unify the Mongols. And I'm sorry, the Qin Dynasty was the first to unify the China. And as a result of the Warring States period, China was very fractured. And so eventually the Qin came in and they unified China, and that moved forward from the Qin to the Hans. The Seljuk Turks were a group of Turkish Central Asian nomads. They conquered a lot of the Middle East about the time of the Crusades. China's Great Leap Forward was under Mao. It was the economic reforms under Mao. And the Great Leap Forward was where collectivism, that's the key word there, collectivism. So collectivism was where Mao was trying to industrialize and take land away from the landlords in China. And it was Mao's way to bring into China. A direct result of the Great Leap Forward was ultimately the mass famines that stole a lot of the food sources and the animals. And Mao was selling a lot of the crops overseas. He could build the bomb. The effects of communism, well, number one, it was a Cold War conflict between communism and capitalism. We talked about the mass murder of millions of people by communist regime. Ideologically speaking, communism attempted to employ Karl Marx's theories, but it never quite, it just never quite came to fruition. And ultimately, I would say, with communism, I think one of the questions that seems to come up is the fall of communism. So how communism eventually collapsed. And that, that was certainly something with the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism throughout Eastern Europe. But with communism, you have to also be very keenly aware, one of the effects of communism was the rise of the Union and eventually the different economies that came about. Communist economies did not survive. They simply just did not survive. And as a result of that, both China and the Soviet Union merged more towards a liberal capitalist economy. But I think ultimately the legacy of communism is going to always reside and always, be a Cold War topic that communism did not sustain. The Seljuk Turks did, yes, they did come into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, but they were also definitely involved with the Crusades. Someone asked what time periods you should most pay attention to. Periods 3, 4, 5, and 6, for sure. 3, 4, 5, 6. That's where all the essays come from. Syncretism is just the blending of different cultures and the blending of different the blending of different cultures, the blending of different religions, languages, music. I mean, I think that syncretism could be a really good essay topic. Or a short answer topic. You have to give questions of, the examples of syncretism for sure. So just think about the blending, the mixture of two different cultures, religions, groups of people. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a good example of the lesson of mutually assured destruction. The government was allowing the Soviet Unions to come in and build missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Ultimately, though, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of reduced the tensions by each compromising. And so it was that idea that knowing how one side could destroy the other. So both sides eventually gave in, but it was the closest, it was one of the closest in the Cold War to where both sides almost, nuclear holocaust almost came to fruition, Do I have any helpful studying tips? Yeah, I mean, focus on what you don't know. That's always a good one. Focus on what you don't know. And I know the lighting sucks in here, but I'm up in the clubhouse in my apartment. So the last thing I wanted was Willis making comments about what I had hanging on the walls in my apartment. Oh my God. You guys are crazy with this stuff. Now, can you add details to anything? Wes, seriously, come on, man. Can you add details to anything that you haven't said in class before? I mean, my gosh, you need to be a little more, specific. I see some of the Chandler kids. What's up, everybody from Chandler? Very nice to see you all. Yeah, I feel bad that my DC kids are not representing themselves very well here tonight. I'm sure it's all very comical, everybody. Okay, let's get back on track. Wes, give me more specifics. Southeast Asian empires. Okay, that's a good one. So you've got Southeast Asian. You've got, well, one of the great ones was the Srivijaya Empire, which was an example of a philosocracy. Remember, a philosocracy. I hate this word. A philosocracy is the those are water-based empires. Those are empires that are that build up their territories near water. So you have the Srivijaya Empire, you have the Selendra Empire. Those are empires that were in modern-day Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia area. You also have the Khmer Empire, which was an empire in Southeast Asia, modern-day Cambodia. In fact, that's the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, which was that was the 1970s, the communist regime that came into Cambodia and mass murdered and committed acts of genocide. So I think that, you know, with Southeast Asia, one thing to always be aware of is sinification. The Chinese had great influence over Southeast Asia, as well as some of the religious spreads. So you've got the spread of Buddhism that was big in Southeast Asia. You've got Hinduism with some of the architecture. Angkor Wat is one of the largest Hindu temples in the world. So Angkor Wat is evidence that Hinduism spread heavily into Southeast Asia. So ultimately, I would say, you know, to Jason's question, I mean, Southeast Asia, it doesn't feature prominently, but it was sort of an area, and here's a good way to phrase it. Southeast Asia was sort of the crossroads of so much trade and cultural diffusion and syncretism. You have Islam, you've got all the different world religions, but trade was central to the nature of Southeast Asian empires. Fascism is an extremely conservative rule of government. So after World War II, after World War I, when European governments were really teetering on the brink of collapse, you have two fascist governments that came to power, one in Italy, one in Germany. And Italy and Germany turned to fascism as a way to bolster nationalism. Fascism is tied directly to nationalistic movements. But I would say that the core value of fascism is the idea that the individual surrenders itself to the state. Everything's in the name of the state. Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany were able to convince people that the government was the main attraction for people. Like that was what everything was about. What's best for the government. So fascism was a direct effect of World War I. It's something that happened as a result of World War I. And these fascist governments, they tended to be militaristic. So they built up the militaries, they used force, they used intimidation to exert their powers. They denied people of their natural rights and liberties. So that's Italy, Germany, and Japan kind of had like a fascist government as well. So yeah, that's fascism comes as a result of World War I. Major events in the French Revolution. I would say that, you know, the French Revolution, it's really just all about the Enlightenment and the effects of the Enlightenment coming into action. Obviously, the main event is the end of the monarchy. I mean, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette were killed as a result of this revolution. But one of the major effects of the French Revolution was the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon came to power at the end of the revolution. But it's ultimately an example of how the Enlightenment inspired change in government. You will never be asked like super specifics, but I think that two things that I love about the French Revolution that we talked about this year. One was like the creation of a constitution. You know, France did create a constitution, and also the rise of women's rights. This is one of the few areas where issues like women's rights was being discussed in the French Revolution. You know, we had the Olympic Gouges reading you guys did in class. So certainly the rise of women's rights. Women were demanding the rights in France at a time period where women were not at all usually allowed to speak out in public. The Communist Manifesto was Karl Marx. That was Marx's theories about the workers of the world will unite. It's the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and the Communist Manifesto was ultimately the backbone of communist revolutions. They believed in this, the end of class society. They thought that Marx thought that there would be class warfare, and ultimately, you know, that's something that Marx, you know, the unintended consequence of Marx was ultimately that, you know, when communism spread into governments, that was definitely unintended by Marx. I'm trying to get through all these, and I'm literally just blocking all these people. How diverse was the Indian Ocean trade? Well, with Indian Ocean trade, you have with Indian Ocean trade, you've got incredible amounts of diversity. You have East Africa, you've got Islam, you know, Islamic merchants. Eventually, you have Europeans that came in there. The Indian Ocean also, don't forget, was the slave trade. There's a huge slave trade, just as big as the transatlantic slave trade. And the Indian Ocean was for sure one of the most diverse trade networks in world history. And it's a good example. They always ask questions about how humans learned to manipulate nature, to learn the monsoon wind patterns. You know, merchants and sailors had to learn about the patterns of the wind there. The Chauvin and the Olmec, wow, okay, that's a throwback. So the Chauvin and the Olmec were early, they were like period one native societies. And those are just good examples of early societies in the Americas. The Olmec were in Mesoamerica, and the Chauvin were South America, the Andes Mountains regions. So you could argue that like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmec were sort of like their ancestors, and then with the Chauvin, you have the Inca in the South America. But that's period one. So you know, maybe the artwork, native artwork, you know, the heads, the big stone heads. That was a big theme there as well. Oh my God, this is like turning into a just laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism, Amara asked this. Laissez-faire capitalism is the idea that the government should leave the economy alone. It should not intervene. It should not intervene in the economy. So this was a big idea of Adam Smith. And as a result of that, many liberal governments around the world embrace capitalism. And that's one of the defining differences between you know, capitalism and communism, laissez-faire economics. The idea that the government should not intervene, should just let the economy take its course. The Han Dynasty's probably greatest achievement would be the inclusion of Confucianism as a deeply embedded philosophy within China. You have the civil service exams, the tribute system that started under the Han Dynasty, the expansion of the Great Wall of China as well. But the Han ran into opposition during its empire. There was the Taoists ran into great conflict with the Han Confucianists. And as a result of that, the Taoists revolted. That's the Yellow Turban Revolt. So, but the Han Dynasty's greatest achievement definitely is Confucianism, the establishment and the entrenchment of Confucianism. Absolutes is just the idea that like absolute monarchies, so that the monarchies, they had absolute power. This is mostly tied to Europe. You get divine right in there as well. The Punic Wars were wars that were fought between the Roman Empire and the Carthage. That was like Hannibal when he crossed the Alps. The Peloponnesian Wars were wars fought between Athens and their allies and Sparta and its allies. The Boer Wars were England versus the Dutch. England versus the Dutch. The English defeated the Dutch, and the English took over South Africa for its diamonds and the ability to build the railroad. Liberalism is the idea of free speech. It's the idea of natural rights. It's the idea of capitalism. It's essentially what countries like the United States and most of Europe gravitated towards. It was an idea that came from the Enlightenment. So you always want to tie liberalism back to the Enlightenment. When you're talking about the economic liberalism, then you are looking at the freedom of the economy. Back to what Amara asked about the laissez-faire economics. So liberalism really encompasses all those ideas. Ming Dynasty, major points. So the Ming Dynasty was sort of like the Renaissance, the Confucian Renaissance, and then the Ming Dynasty was. It rebuilt China after the Mongols had ruled China for so long, and so they reinstigated Confucianism. They brought that back. The Ming also, remember the big tribute system, that was the Zheng He, the explorations under the Ming Dynasty. And during the Ming Dynasty, you really have the idea of China becoming once again a global center of the universe. It was a center and a hub for trade. So the Ming were, part of that Chinese Renaissance that occurred after the fall of the Yuan or Mongol rule. All right. Janine asks, was liberalism linked back to the Back to Africa movement? Yeah, I would say part of liberalism was the self-determination. Yeah, part of that was the idea of self-determination. A lot of liberalism crept into the decolonization movement. Yeah, absolutely. Feudalism is the idea of, it was in Europe and Japan. So Europe and Japan were 100% societies that evolved in feudalism. And feudalism is the idea of tethering people, tying people down to the land. Wealthy landowners would control the land, and then people would effectively work the land, and they really had very little power. The era of feudalism in Europe was during the Middle Ages, whereas in Japan, remember, feudalism was central to the Tokugawa era. That was that period of intense isolation. And as a result of that, feudalism in Europe, really kept people down. It was a society, it was a social hierarchy, an economic system where ultimately, people were tied down. There was very little social mobility in that time period. But I would say that, like with feudalism, something to be aware of is in Japan, how feudalism ultimately led to the Tokugawa period. The Edo period was like a golden age of Japanese culture. Poetry, the arts flourished. Remember the national anthem of Japan? During that time period, the oldest national anthem in the world. So the Edo period is sort of this golden age of arts and whatnot in Japanese history. Causes and effects of causes of World War I. You've got nationalism, you've got imperialism, you've got militarism, the buildup of militaries, and the alliances. Right, that was a huge thing with World War I. The alliances. You don't need to know that. Okay, Murphy. Jesus, calm down, Murph. High Aden Min, the Ming Dynasty. The high-end period was a period of Japanese prosperity. It came right before the it came right before the Tokugawa period. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to catch up. You guys are now just really like pumping me full of questions. I'm a little distracted. So causes of the alliances, you have the Germans, the Ottomans, they were the big allies, and the Austrian-Hungarians. And then you have the French, the British, the Russians, and the Americans that were the other alliance in World War I. What areas did Japan have influence over? Well, Danica, you need to clarify your time period. Spread of Islam was primarily done through merchant activity, conquest, and Sufi missionaries. Those are the three main ideas of how Islam spread. So you had the wars, the Islam spread through conquest throughout North Africa and the Middle East. You had the spread of missionaries that went as far as Southeast Asia. The Sufi missionaries, they went into all parts of the Middle East as well, and North Africa, spreading Islam. And then you have trade, through the merchant activity. Major restoration in Japan was after the Tokugawa shogunate. The Japanese rapidly industrialized. They became a world power by moving forward with industry. They ultimately were able to put Japan on a collision course towards World War II by effectively moving forward with industry. Whereas China, for example, was unable to industrialize. This gave the old adage, if you don't industrialize, you get imperialized. So Japan was able to move forward with a Meiji Restoration. They adopted Western culture, Western style of government, economy, and this really made Japan a world power, a world superpower in Asia. King Charles's beheading was part of the English Civil War. Globalization through internet affects societies. Well, I mean, there's no borders with the internet, so you can talk to people, you can do things like this. Give me a moment here. Collect my thoughts. I'm just trying to catch up here, review them. God, what is people's deal, man? This is like just bizarre. People are like doing this. Yes, I'm talking about the Enlightenment stuff or the environment stuff tomorrow, Janine. Glorious Revolution, good one. We haven't gone over this. Glorious Revolution was a peaceful revolution where the government of England transitioned from one monarch to the next. That's the bringing in of William and Mary. And it was really, it was part of the Enlightenment. The English had gone through the horrors of the English Civil War. But they changed their government peacefully without any bloodshed during the Glorious Revolution. The Peace of Westphalia was the end of the 30 Years' War, which was the religious war between Catholics and Protestants. Yes, so easy. I remember you. Otto von Bismarck. Oh, this is a good one. Germany was a fractured country throughout most of its existence. It existed in just different states. But Otto von Bismarck was a nationalistic general that pushed for all the different German states to come together as one And Germany, through its nationalistic movement, really went from a split up, fractured collection of states to one of the great powers of Europe. And its sense of nationalism was what brought Germany together. Very similar to also how Italy was brought together. Wes, it's only awkward if you think it's awkward. I have other things that I'm trying to do simultaneously. So I'm trying to multitask. All right. SAQ format, it's simple. Identify and explain. So two sentences, identify and explain. That's pretty much it. You have to first state the fact and then give the explanation hows and whys. Oceania was an area where the Polynesian migrations predominantly the Polynesian migration spread as peoples moved all throughout Oceania. With Oceania, you also have the development of settler colonies, right? New Zealand and Australia were settler colonies for the UK, the British, or squatter colonies. So Oceania, though, I think the biggest thing to take away from Oceania is the Polynesian migrations, the movement of various Polynesian peoples. And that's something we're going to bring up tomorrow, the environmental problems that Polynesian peoples experience as they lived on these islands and farmed and they overused the land. They moved from one island to the next throughout Oceania. Downfall of the Ottomans was World War I. Yeah, World War I brought down the Ottomans, but even before that, the Ottomans were losing territory to the British, the French, the Russians. They were all competing for Ottoman territory. So the Ottomans lost their territory. There was the Balkans independence movements that were going on before World War I, but ultimately it was World War I that brought about the end of the Ottomans. Oh, okay, we haven't heard about Industrial Revolution. So causes of the Industrial Revolution. Well, you had the growth in technology. New technologies were emerging, the scientific revolution. You also had new advents in, oh my gosh. No, I'm not happy. This is like, you guys are like just going crazy. The scientific revolution was also a big part of the Industrial Revolution because you have all the new advents in technology going on. And I think another big cause of the Industrial Revolution was you had the growth of the colonies. And so the colonies were providing all these raw materials for the home countries. And so England and France and these countries that rapidly industrialized, they had all these different resources that they were pulling into their factory systems. And ultimately, as a result of these causes, the different countries were able to build up their factory systems. Now, something else that's important with the Industrial Revolutions is the fact that the Europeans had a lot of natural resources like coal. And so you needed coal. You needed coal to really build up your factory systems as a form of fossil fuels. And so a lot of the Industrial Revolution's causes were really just based on geography. But I would say, just again, because this is a huge topic. So causes, I would say you have the growth of technology, you've got the natural resources, the raw materials that were being brought in from the colonies. And then the effects of the Industrial Revolution, well, you've got I mean, you've got the shift from China to Europe. I mean, that's probably the biggest one. China lost its status as the all-time, world power of, manufacturing power of the world. European countries, took over the control of most of the manufacturing. So, and as a result of that, right, Europe now was in the driver's seat economically. They controlled much of the world trade, and certainly that was a huge effect of the Industrial Revolution that was going on. I did the Protestant Reformation before, and again, what I would say about the Protestant Reformation, it's that divide between Catholics and Protestants. I don't think you need to necessarily know like key peoples, other than like Martin Luther. John Calvin was a big name in the Protestant Reformation, but it's an example of sectarianism. It's an example of sectarianism. Different, two different, very different ideologies. My God. Sorry again. I'm just reacting to these comments, and people just get tossed left and right. This is just this is unfortunate. I'm probably going to end this thing a little short. I don't really understand like why people are abusing this privilege. It's pretty unfortunate. So I really just don't understand what's going on here. Main parts of period 3 and 4. I did that on the sneaky ATW. Period 3 of the spread of Islam. You've got the growth of global trade routes. You got the Mongols also coming into power in period 4. You got the arrival of the Gunpowder empires. So really, I think period 3 is really just, it's truly like the emergence of Islam is one of the biggest topics. Global trade routes, Africa. Africa is the emergence of Africa is really a huge part of the period 3. Africa was a cultural and religious and trade center. The Bantu migrations that were ongoing throughout period 3, there was definitely the growth there. During period 3. Let's see. I want to go back. When did the Portuguese first start colonizing? Can you go over some of the names? So the Portuguese began to step out. The Portuguese began to step out into West Africa in the mid to late 1400s, and they began to sail around the coast of West Africa. And eventually, went all the way to India, and the Portuguese really began to spread out into the Indian Ocean. So from West Africa, they went and dominated the Indian Ocean. I would say that the Portuguese were the first European power to go into Africa. But remember, they stayed along the coastline. They didn't go into the interior. Oh, I see some WHAP legends from last year. Unmol, Inshara, you guys all did really well. 4s and 5s, if I remember. And nice to see the old Chandler gang from last year. So yeah, I would say the Portuguese, and then remember the Portuguese by mistake went to Brazil. They discovered Brazil. Okay, other questions? I don't know. Oh, Berlin Conference. So Berlin Conference was where European leaders were dividing up Europe. I'm sorry, Africa. Shoot, Africa. They were were dividing up Africa. And this is during the age of imperialism. That was the Berlin Conference. How did the Crusades change Europe? Trade. It brought in a lot of Middle Eastern trade, a lot of Middle Eastern goods, and ultimately the Crusades, they strengthened the Catholic Church's position. The Church, was really the driving force behind the Crusades. The Church used religion to justify attacks on Muslims and the reconquest of Jerusalem. Ultimately, the Crusades failed. The Muslims held on to Jerusalem all the way till the creation of Israel. Neo-Confucianism is the blending of Confucianism along with Buddhism and Taoism. So Neo-Confucianism is the big three. If you take three of the Asian philosophies and religions, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, you merge them together. It developed in China, but it spread throughout, especially Japan. Anina was asking about the sinification of Asia. Well, the Chinese had such immense power and influence over Asia that the Chinese ultimately they spread their philosophy and their cultures to other parts of Asia. And so Neo-Confucianism is a great example too of syncretism, the blending of different religions together. The Pueblo Revolt was an uprising of Native Americans in modern-day New Mexico against the Spanish. It's one of the few examples of how Native groups successfully revolted against the Europeans. But it was short-lived. The Europeans eventually reconquered the territories. Goodbye, Cassidy. Spheres of influence was sort of a form of imperialism in China. It's how the Europeans were carving up China and taking over different sections of China for trade purposes. That's the idea of spheres of influence. Totalitarianism is more or less it can be used to describe a variety of different government styles of rule. It's total authority, so the government just has total authority over everything. Oftentimes, total authority can lead to things like the mass murders of peoples under Mao Zedong. It can lead to collectivism policies under Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans. It can lead to the growth of Hitler's agenda against Jewish people. Right? The government just has total authority. In absolutism, it's the idea that the power of the government is vested in one absolute ruler. So it's in a way similar to totalitarianism, but I would say that you would not. I would say you would only want to define absolutism in terms of the context of monarchies. Keep it with monarchies. The decline of the Byzantine Empire came as a result of the spread of Islam. The Ottoman Empire conquered the Byzantine Empire, brought it down in the 1400s. So as Islam spread across the Middle East and into Eastern Europe, it came in direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Muslim merchants spread Islam into the Middle East, but they also, because Islam was a religion that promoted trade as a way to, trade was regulated. It was well adopted into the cultures of Islam. So Muslim merchants brought all that into Islam, and they brought all that Islamic culture into the Indian Ocean area, and they set up those diaspora communities. I keep going back to that. Yes, 9/11 is definitely a terrorist attack. The scramble for Africa was in Africa. European countries scrambled all over Africa looking for territories. They wanted to Christianize the Africans. They wanted to build railroads. They wanted to bring technology into Africa to grow their businesses. And it's a big difference between how Africa was first. When Africa was first, influenced by the Europeans, it was mostly on the coastline. Um, you're welcome, Haley. Yeah, I don't, you guys are like really like, this is just, what are the differences with the Mongol Khanates? Well, the Mongols divided their empire, was so large, they divided it up into different territories. So the Mongol Khanates were ultimately just, the different septs. And that's how they divided their empires. Most of their empires are just divided up by the regions because they had such diverse people. But you do not need to, know like all the names of the different Mongol Khanates. What's the other popular syncretic religion? Is Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is the combination of Buddhism and Confucianism. The Delhi Sultanate was the first group of people that went into, the first Muslims that went into India. That was the first time Islam spread into India. The Swahili coast was the east coast of Africa. That's where the Swahili coast was where you had a lot of East African culture, city-states, trade city-states, port cities were big there. Syncretism, the blending of Islam. Islam grew predominantly in East Africa. And one thing, and you guys are just giving me so many questions. You have to slow down, please. There's no way I can catch up on all these. Something I want to say about Africa. Remember, everything below the Sahara Desert is sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got everything below the Sahara Desert is Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa. So it's really East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa. That's all part of sub-Saharan. So you could always include that in your answer. You can always include that in your answer. Hindus and Buddhists have a good relationship in India. Yes, for the most part. I'd say that the real like ethnic tension that occurred in India was mostly related to Islam and Hindus, Muslims and Hindus. There was usually that tension. So there wasn't so much tension between Hindus and Buddhists. But it's important to remember that Buddhism started in India. The Encomienda system was the use of Native Americans in the Spanish Empire as labor. The slave trade in the colonial exchange end. Predominantly the slave trade. So the end of the slave trade was in the early 1800s due to the Enlightenment. There was call for lots of reforms in Europe as a result of the Enlightenment. And so European countries began to ban the slave trade. But slavery still did continue in a form known as the coolie system, right? Indentured servitude was continued on in the British Empire, for example, with South Asians. So even though the slave trade was eventually banned, it still continued in the other forms of labor. The jizya is a tax on non-Muslims in Muslim empires, and the janissaries were Christian young men that were kidnapped from their homes and families, and they were forced to fight in the Islamic Ottoman Empire. All right, I'm trying to go back and catch up on these. Global effect of the Colombian exchange. Well, it's such a broad topic. I mean, the Colombian exchange was the foods, right? The new diets, the new animals introduced in different parts of the world. You've got the different peoples, the religions, the languages. It's all that coming together as one. Spain and Portugal began to lose their powers as global. Portugal began to lose their power first, as the British and the Dutch and French really emerged with their joint stock companies. The Portuguese just simply couldn't come up. Spain began to lose its power during the Creole revolutions in the 1800s, when much of the Spanish Empire began to fall apart. Examples of genocide, you've got the Armenian genocide, you've got the European Holocaust genocide. You've got the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s in Africa. You've got the Cambodian genocide in the 1970s. You've got the Yugoslavian genocide in the Balkans in the 1990s. Those are definitely some good examples of genocide. Let's see. The Treaty of Nanjing was when oh, hi, Sarah. The Treaty of Nanjing was when the British gained greater trade rights after the Opium Wars. Sikhism is a syncretic religion. I would just say be aware of it. I don't think you need to know its belief systems. It's a blend of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. You know, it's a good example of syncretic processes. And India is really just a good example of syncretism in general, because you always had so many different groups of peoples. The corvée system is a type of forced labor that was used mainly in China, in which people were forced into doing labor for the government. So in other words, instead of paying taxes, you performed labor. It was mostly used in China. But it was also used in the Roman Empire. It was used in some of the imperialism. So I would just say corvée system is when people perform labor as a form of like taxation. So the Umayyad Caliphate spread throughout North Africa and Spain. That's when Islam went into Europe under the Umayyad dynasty. That dynasty lasted for about 100 or so years. And the Abbasid dynasty, like, you got to think of these two as they're very separate dynasties. They're both Sunni, but they're both of the Sunni school of thought. And ultimately, the Abbasid dynasty lasted for most of the Crusades. They were very influential in the Crusades. And the Abbasid was kind of like this golden age of Islam. It's really when Islam prospered and built up its trade, its cultural diffusion was going strong, education, universities, etc. Gunpowder empires, 3, I already did this. The gunpowder, you have the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Ottoman, Safavid, and the Mughal Empire in India. Zaibatsu. This person keeps asking about this. I don't really know much about this term. I just Googled it, which I guess you guys could all do that. It's like large businesses in Japan. I literally just Googled it for the first time. Ottoman Empire is like modern day Turkey, much of the Balkans, much of the Middle East. Oh, the Spanish silver trade, that's a good one. The Philippines. So the Philippines was like where a lot of the silver flowed first, and then from there it's dispersed throughout Asia. So the Philippines became a destination for a lot of merchants, and the Spanish held the Philippines all the way up to the Americans took over the Philippines in the late 1890s. So the Philippines was a destination for a lot of trade. Japan restricted foreign influence during the Tokugawa period. They banned foreigners. They killed missionaries. They expelled Christians. They tortured and killed a lot of Christians. So the Japanese took a violent approach to getting rid of foreigners. China's economy was ruined during the silver trade. Effectively, this is during the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. So the silver trade started to hit China in the 1600s, and this continued on. The Chinese just became overwhelmed with their reliance upon silver. They rely too much on silver. Proselytization is missionaries. So during the age of exploration, missionaries spread Christianity, different brands of Christianity all throughout we talked about the Spanish, they had their missions. The French had their the Jesuit missionaries with education, good relationships with the natives. And then you had the English had the praying towns. So ultimately, the proselytization is a good vocabulary word for like missionary work. All right, give me 1 second here to catch my breath. Take a deep breath here. We'll go over everything. Okay, all right. Man, you guys are just going. You've got to slow down with these questions. Hey, by the way, stop saying WTF. Okay, so the Opium Wars were wars fought in China. The English were importing opium at alarming rates, dulling the senses of a lot of Chinese people, and this led to China weakening under the Europeans. So it's how the British began to gain more influence in China. The Haitian Revolution was successful. The Haitian peoples formed their own government. The first government led by former slaves. The Europeans, the French lost the Haitian Revolution. It's incredibly bloody. It was incredibly bloody, and as a result of this, the Haitians formed their own government. But that by no means was how meant that the Haitian government was going to be successful. The Haitian government struggled at first to establish itself, but it was a landmark Enlightenment revolution. Jomo Kenyatta was Kenya. The amount of time that people are taking to create fake accounts is really pathetic. Okay, the Taiping Rebellion is really, really important. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the most violent rebellions in the history of human existence. About 20 million people died in the Civil War. The Taiping Rebellion was fought mostly by peasants who followed a Christian leader who claimed to be a descendant of Jesus Christ. Now, Christianity had spread to China by the Europeans, but ultimately, the Taiping Rebellion was a challenge to the Qing Empire's authority. Just like the White Lotus, it was another rebellion against the Qing, Qing. So the Qing Empire, they were foreigners. They were Manchurian, so they were considered foreigners, and they had a difficult time keeping power in China throughout their rule, and they were eventually overthrown when Sun Yat-sen and the Nationalist Party came to power in China. The self-strengthening program was China's attempt to industrialize. It ultimately somewhat failed. The Chinese were not able to industrialize properly, and as a result of that, the Chinese were eventually imperialized. They were taken over in various parts of their country by Europeans, by the Japanese. Taiping Rebellion was in China. Yes, the Spanish flu was worldwide. Worldwide, 50 million people. Some 600,000 or so Americans died. The coolie system was a form of indentured servitude of South Asians. After the British stopped using African slaves, they began to import South Asians. Taiwan could feature prominently because Taiwan is where the nationalist government fled. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government was set up in Taiwan after they were defeated by the Communist Party. Yeah, the corvée and the coolie system are different. Well, the Mughal Empire is a good example of a minority religion group that ruled over a majority of another religion. So in India, you had majority Hindu population that were ruled by Muslims. And the Mughal Empire was the last empire in India before the Europeans took over. The Europeans began to, with the joint stock companies, infiltrate India. The Mughals lost their powers gradually, and as a result of this, the Mughal Empire eventually would collapse under the weight of the British East India Company. And so the Mughal Empire, though, probably like the most important thing to take away from the Mughal Empire is the growth of Islam. And Islam's influence in South Asia is tremendous when you consider today that South Asia is, more Muslims live in South Asia, other than Indonesia. More Muslims live in India than any other country. So someone's asking about Muhammad Ali. We didn't cover this a lot in our class, but I think that in any country where there's opposition to industrialization, it's mostly when traditionalist societies oppose the progress of an industry. So industrialization is sometimes met with opposition in certain countries because countries prefer to be traditionalist. The Warsaw Pact was communist, military alliance. Neo-Confucianism, I already said this. It's a syncretic religion. So its influence, it's there. It provides an alternative path for people. The end of the U.S. Neutrality Act began with Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Joint stock companies were like modern day big businesses. They were how companies began to conquer various parts of Africa, of Europe. I'm sorry, not Europe, India, the Americas. So companies would get permission from the government to build colonies. And we've used this before. It'd be like if Google was like conquering parts of Africa today. So ultimately, joint stock companies were highly influential in terms of spreading Europe's influence all over the world. And one of the greatest examples of joint stock companies was the British and the Dutch East India Company. I need you guys to slow down on the questions, man. I just simply cannot keep up. I cannot keep up. You guys are asking so many different questions. Coptic Christianity is a form of Christianity that spread throughout Africa. It's a form of Christianity that spread throughout East Africa, mostly in like the Ethiopia region. It's just a type of Christianity there. White man's burden, social Darwinism, is the idea that the white Europeans felt they had a duty, a Christian duty, to imperialize around the world. And the white man's burden was the poem through which we read in class that it really epitomized the themes and the ideas of European imperial and American imperialism. Let's see. Sorry, losing my train of thought. Okay. Um, Sorry, I gotta get back on gear here. I'm gonna scroll up. The domino effect was the idea that communism would spread beyond the Soviet Union. So especially in Asia, the Americans had this great fear that communism was going to spread beyond China, and it did. It went to Korea, went to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. So the United States had this great fear that communism was going to spread all over. The Edict of Nantes was the religious toleration that the French government offered for Protestants. There were a lot of French Protestants, and they were called Huguenots. And so the Edict of Nantes was this religious, it's an example of religious toleration. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that the United States wanted to keep Europeans away from colonizing in Latin and South America. It allowed for America to dominate the economics of the Western Hemisphere. So I mentioned this in the sneaky topics. With South America, the Caribbean, Latin America, the United States was able to dominate the trade in that region, especially with the Panama Canal, and that was a big part of our foreign policies there. Civil rights movement was the civil rights movement. I mean, you have the you've got the Gandhi with the civil rights movement, Satyagraha you got the Gandhi with the Satyagraha movement in India. That was to improve the lives of Indians under the British rule. You've got the civil rights movement led by the ANC in South Africa against the apartheid. You've got the American civil rights movement. So, there are various civil rights movements designed to use nonviolent peace, peaceful protests, boycotts, strikes against governments like in South Africa with the apartheid. Red Scare is the fear of communism spreading. Tips for the DBQ, boy, study the rubric, know exactly what's on the rubric. We will about in our class, make sure everything prompt. You have to do a minimum of 3 SAP. You have to use document, but more importantly, you have to tie everything together. So your example of knowledge, your example of PSF, contextualization, it's all going to come back to the question. You can't just write random topics. But I think the minimum, you got to summarize all 6 documents. You got to do 3 SAP. Bring outside knowledge. That's 3 points right there. That's all. You're off to a pretty good start. Jesus. So Mexico's revolution. Mexico had 2 revolutions in history. It had the revolution against the Spanish in the early 1800s with it had the revolutions against the Spanish to free themselves. And then Mexico also had another revolution in the early 1900s to overthrow its government. So Mexico has gone through 2 intense revolutions in its history. Modern day Mexico is very similar to the way it looks today, thanks to its revolution in the early 1900s. I think with Mexico, again, the idea here is that it's a good example of Enlightenment, and it's also a good example of the idea of land redistribution. I'm not going to give anyone moderator privileges. I appreciate, I know this is frustrating. I'm doing the best I can. How do you do little writing part of the short answer questions? Yeah, it's identify and explain, hows and whys. Law of 2 sentences per response. Serfdom was during the Middle Ages, feudalism. So it was a policy of people working the land. The Russians used serfdom to control people in their empire. So serfdom was a form of labor. The space race was the fight between the United States and Soviet Union to control outer space. It was a Cold War. It was something that was going on in the Cold War. And the United States ultimately won the Cold War. I'm sorry, won the Cold War, yeah, but also ultimately won the space race by beating the Soviets to the moon. If you don't know how to write a short answer, write and pray. I don't know. If you don't know the answer, yes, make something up that sounds right, honestly. Write something that you, I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you guys. You get stuck in a prompt, you just got to write. You got to write something that seems, you know, like the best answer. I don't know what to tell you. Vietnam is still communist. Yes, Vietnam is still communist. Tribute system was mostly China. There are no social credit. It's all or nothing. Period 3, 4, 5, and 6. How many paragraphs are good LEQ? It doesn't really matter. I mean, they're not grading. They're not looking at how many paragraphs you write. You got to make sure with LEQ. I would say, okay, you have contextualization, thesis. I think you should come up with four points of evidence. So if it's a change over time continuities essay, come up with 2 examples of change over time, 2 examples of continuities. If it's similarities and differences, 2 examples of similarities, 2 examples of differences. Fundamentalist groups, you've got Wahhabism, which is an Islamic group. You have the government of Iran, which is fundamentalist. You've got Christian fundamentalist groups like the KKK. You've got radical Hindu groups. I mean, fundamentalism is just the idea of radicalism within religions and societies. I have done the spread of Islam multiple times tonight. I would like to try and get a few more questions. I can pivot back to that. Did the Mongols get tribute from China? No, the Mongols took over China. There was no getting tribute. The Mongols took over China. Oh, okay. Bye, Advait. Thanks for coming in, man. Good luck on Thursday. Guys, we only have 2 days left, and so you can practice short answers on your own. You can bring them to tutoring. There are short answer questions on the internet, on the College Board website. Oh, hey, Caitlin, welcome. Hope all is well. Good luck. Oh, all right. I've already done the core-based system so many times. It's the use of people for labor. Instead of paying taxes, they use people for labor. So the government forces people to perform labor instead of paying their taxes. Okay, bye, Aiden. Thanks for coming in. Tell your sister I said good luck too. Oh, okay, Muslim ulamas, this is a good one. So Muslim ulamas were scholars. They helped interpret the Quran, and they helped write Islamic law like Sharia law. The ulama can be both Shia or Sunni, it doesn't really matter. And these people held a lot of power within the theocracies of the Islamic governments. The Chinese scholar gentry, these were the Confucian nobles. Like these were people that were high-ranking government officials. The scholar gentry rose to power under the Han Dynasty, and then eventually they really gained prominence during the Sung Dynasty. That was the peak of the scholar gentry. The 7-Year War The 7-Year War was a war that was fought on 3 continents. It was fought in Europe, the Americas, and also in Asia, in India. The British and the French fought for control of their colonies. So in America, the 7-Year War is known as the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War was ultimately won by the British. And the British, in winning this war, took over really all the territories. It took over all the French territories in the Americas, but this is a war that also was fought on other continents as well, and the British won this war commandingly. This is also what kind of directly led to eventually the American Revolution, because the British they began overtaxing the colonies as a result of the fact that they were overtaxing their people, because they had to pay all these war debts. I don't know who Bender is, but I'm putting Bender in timeout. Yeah, thank you, Ben Darling. Sikhism, I've gone over that one. Animism is the belief in spirits. Animism is the belief in it's spiritual worship. It's a polytheistic religion. It's mostly practiced in it was practiced widely in like African societies, Native American societies, but it's attributing like spiritual power to elements of nature. That's the idea of animism. Humanism was a good Renaissance idea. It's the focus on the human experience. It's the idea of looking at the human experience within society. It's focusing on how humans, it's the exploration of the sciences and math, etc. And so humanism was a big movement within the Enlightenment. Humanism was a big movement within the Enlightenment. Oh, you're welcome, Danica. The Mongols tried to invade Japan and then also Vietnam. The Sykes-Picot Treaty was after World War I, it was towards the end of World War I. It's how the Europeans took over a lot of the Ottoman Empire's land in the Middle East. What powered Germany? I would say, Germany was backed by Nazism. The Nazis just had absolute power, absolute control over the people. But Germany was also powered by its industrialism. It was technologically advanced. But I would say, a bigger part of the question is how, nobody really stopped Germany as they were spreading. Germany was just sort of left to, they were kind of let alone. That was the whole appeasement part. Okay, to satisfy Owen's request here, look, the major world religions, I think what you guys mostly are going to need to be aware of are a couple points. And trying to memorize all the specifics of these is really not, like, you don't need to remember like the specific 10 commandments. You don't remember the specific eightfold path. But what I would do is maybe organize, and let me see, actually. I may be able to find a resource online that just kind of nice and neatly organizes it all for you, because I think that'd be a lot. For some of these topics, it's just a lot simpler than me trying to, yeah. This is a good one. I'm gonna see if that link should work for you guys. That's a really good breakdown. I would screenshot or print that or whatever for your notes. I think that, you know, the world religions is going to be, it's going to come on there, and the world religions is most likely going to feature, and somehow, you know, the missionaries, the spread of these religions across the globe, the impacts that they had, you know, in terms of culture, syncretism. I mean, I think that the world religions are really going to feature. That's mostly period 2 and 3, by the way. So if you're asking a question of period 2 and 3, you know, another thing that, like, religions, you have to kind of always keep in mind, your religions, like anything else, change over time. So some religions modified, they split, they adapted to the different time periods. But another thing about religion, I would say, is, you know, be aware of religions that promoted the spread through trade. So Islam developed through trade. Buddhism was big through trade. Christianity was big through trade. You know, those were 3 religions that really spread prominently as a result of trade. So their attitudes toward trade is a really good theme for sure. Oh, the Chinese dynasty, everybody, always, every year, gets so worried about the Chinese dynasties. You're not going to have to in order name all Chinese dynasties. The big Chinese dynasties that you're bound to see in periods 2, the classical period, you have the Qin, which was the Qin Shi Huangdi dynasty, and then you had the Han dynasty. That was China's major classical empire. Then you had a brief period where there was a power vacuum before the Sui, which they built the Grand Canal. And then ultimately you get into the Tang dynasty, which was the growth of cities and the growth of technology in China. The Sung dynasty was the civil service and the Confucianism, the peak of that. The Yuan dynasty was that was when the Mongols ruled China. Then you had the Chinese Renaissance with the Ming Dynasty and the return of Confucianism. Also the tribute system. You know, the tribute system was a continuity in China for sure. Let's look at it like this. China, the continuities in China. All right, throughout China's history, China was a trade powerhouse. Throughout China's history, China was also, we used the tribute system to dominate its area, the areas around it. Those are continuities. Also, another continuity with China is manufacturing. China was sorry, I'm untying my shoes here. China was also a major producer of goods. So those are continuities. China, over time, you know, where the big changes came from with China was you could look at, like, the arrival of the Europeans. They brought Christianity into China, and that affected China greatly. You have the impact of European goods in China, like silver, opium. You know, they had detrimental effects on China. That's a major change over time. And then, you know, another major change over time was the loss of power. China went, you know, powerless. China went powerless as a result of the fact that the European manufacturing was far superior than China. I think with the philosophies and all these religion questions, I certainly know all these things, but I think the tendency is everyone gets all, like, worried about these everyone tends to get very worried about the religions. I'm just going to keep trying to share some resources that you guys can find, ones that I think are pretty solid. I would like to, okay, Ben, goodbye. You can go with the flow. Yeah, so the big difference is Confucianism is a rigid like a philosophy. You have filial piety, you've got the loyalty to the government, loyalty to your family, the civil service exams. That was really like the big idea of Confucianism. And with Confucianism, I mean, that still to this day is like one of the most important legacies of the classical period. One of the main ideas of Taoism is that people should, you give up your worldly desires. You give up that all in terms of the pursuit of nature, the pursuit of peace. But they were conflicting philosophies, right? And then legalism was the really strict philosophy where the government should be in control of everyone. And the impact of these long terms, if you look at Chinese culture to this day, I'd say Confucianism, has by far the greatest impact on modern day. Confucianism has by far the greatest impact on modern day China than all the other ones, Taoism and legalism. Social contract theory was an Enlightenment idea. It's the idea that the relationship between people and the government should be as one. People should, the people should follow the laws, and the government should respect the people and protect people's natural rights. Siddhartha Gautama was the name of the Buddha. But yeah, back to social contract theory. It was a principle of the Enlightenment, and it helped establish the principle of a lot of modern day governments and the expectation about the way the governments should relate to the people. Greek city-states fell mainly due to internal conflict. And as a result of that, the Greek city-states, they fought each other, and that led them to become very vulnerable to outside attacks from Macedonia when Alexander the Great's father came in. But the Greek city-states really wound up taking each other down, the internal fighting. Pueblo Revolt I did earlier. It was when Native Americans revolted against the Spanish. It was a Native American revolt against the Spanish. Korea, I would say, like, Korea is for most time. Korea was under the influence of China. It's a sinification example. Confucianism spread to Korea, adopted a lot of Chinese philosophy. Neo-Confucianism went to Korea as well. But Korea had a long-standing dynasty known as the Joseon Dynasty that ruled Korea. Korea eventually, conquered by the Japanese. I think that's one of the most important things. The Japanese, and then Korea under, into a civil war, and that's why communism spread throughout Korea. So that's what I was know about Korea. You've got the sinification, and you've got the fact that Korea fell under the influence of foreign rulers. Zheng He was a Chinese sailor under the Ming Dynasty. He was Muslim, and he helped show China's wealth and status during the Ming Dynasty, and it was an example of the tribute system. The Chinese, they brought giraffes. Remember, I did the whole thing on giraffes. So they spread the giraffes. They brought giraffes. That was the question years ago. They spread that years ago. Or years ago, there was the question on giraffes that my students got really mad about. Yeah, Zheng He was the explorer. Oh my God, you guys are just like, what you know what's hilarious about all this to me? Yes, Neo-Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism. What's hilarious is that all you guys are going to have to face me in school tomorrow, and I know exactly who's doing this crap. Zen Buddhism is Confucianism and Buddhism combined. It's the same religion. Well, I mean, things have calmed down a little bit. I said till 9:30. So if people, I mean, I've kind of done a lot of the same questions. So try to dig here, you know, really try to dig deep and find some questions that we haven't covered yet, you guys. I'm willing to put in another 27 minutes. Is Angkor Wat the Hindu temple? Yes, Jason. Those are good examples of the legacy of the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia. All right. Okay. Sorry, I just taking a break for a minute. All right. Marx versus Lenin. Ooh. Okay. I like that one. So Marx was all about the workers' revolution. He was all about the idea of the proletariat revolting against the bourgeoisie. Under Lenin, you know, Lenin was the first leader of the communist. Lenin was ultimately, well, this is now getting screenshot. So that shouldn't be too hard to figure out that. Okay, so Lenin was the first ruler to implement communism. Now, where Lenin and Marx differed greatly was the issue that the Soviet Union and many countries ran into with communism is how, you know, what happens when your entire society is not all workers. You know, in a lot of these communist revolutions, it was the farmers, the peasants that were brought into the communist revolution. And I see the big difference. So Marx said nothing about collectivism. Collectivism, which really began under Stalin, but collectivism, and Mao used collectivism as well in Cuba and Vietnam. Taking land from the peasants was taking Marx's ideas and implementing it. But that Marx said nothing about collectivism. So collectivism was like an interpretation. Pol Pot was the Cambodian. Pol Pot was the Cambodian leader. To change this question, Taj Mahal was a good example of syncretism. It blends a lot of different forms of Muslim and Hindu architecture, as well as Persian architecture. Don't forget, this is actually on our most recent test. Persia, the influence of Persia in India was really heavy. The Persians brought a lot of influence into India as well, because the Persians helped spread a lot of Islam there. But Stalin gets a bad reputation for mass murder. Stalin set up the gulags as forced labor camps. He had a great terror or great purge in the late 1930s, where he killed off about almost 1 million people. He also starved the Ukrainians to death in an episode which is considered an act of genocide. So Stalin's reputation was as a ruthless mass murderer who did anything to keep his power. The French Reign of Terror, oh, there you go. So during the French Revolution, the French government eventually fell into this sort of state of extreme paranoia and fear. People were killing people for being against the revolution. People were, there was this mass murder, beheadings with the guillotine. It was the ugly, dark time of the French Revolution. And one of the reasons it became so ugly is that the wrong people got it's a good lesson of what happens when the wrong people fall into power. Yes, I talked about Korea earlier. If you go back about 10 or so minutes, the Mauryan and Gupta Empire. The Mauryan was the main characteristic of the Mauryan Empire. Well, first of all, it came first. It was in the classical period, but the Mauryan Empire was the Buddhist under Ashoka the Great, the spread of Buddhism. The Gupta Empire was like a resurgence, a renaissance of Hinduism in the late classical period. So like the 200-300s BC, CE, 200-300 CE. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 was the overthrow of the Qing that was led by the nationalist and Sun Yat-sen. Communist leaders you need to know: Stalin, Lenin, Mao Zedong, maybe Khrushchev, that was the leader after Stalin in the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro in Cuba, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and then Deng Xiaoping, he was the guy with the economic reforms, China was unable to modernize because of the influence of the Europeans and disunity. The Chinese, like effectively, they were all over the place. The Manchurians who came in from the northern part of China to rule China were considered foreigners. And ultimately the Manchurians, they didn't have good, stable control of the country. And so as a result of that, ultimately the Chinese peoples they were too dependent on agriculture, and the European presence was just too strong. They could not repel the Europeans away. They just simply could not repel the Europeans away. The Sassanid Empire was it's a classical. It was a post-classical period. No, I'm sorry, classical Persian Empire. It was the last Persian Empire. I think we talked about this briefly in class. It was the last. It was the last Persian Empire before the spread of Islam. Oh man, I'm running out of steam here. The Battle of the Spanish Armada. That was the Battle of Gravelines. Yeah, that's where the Catholic Spanish tried to take over England. And Queen Elizabeth and the English held off the Spanish, and England became permanently Protestant. The Glorious Revolution affect the American Revolution? Oh, hey Shreya, how are you? I would say that the Glorious Revolution really it changed the relationship with the American colonies, because the British kind of took a hands-off policy towards the colonies for a while. They kind of let the colonies grow on their own and develop independently, and they loosened mercantilism. Abyssinian Empire was the modern-day Ethiopia. It was the one that stood up to the Europeans during the scramble for Africa. Need to be more specific, Price. There's lots of Southeast Asian empires. Somebody asked this at the very beginning. It was mostly trade. the control of trade, the spread of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam as well in that area. But it was really a big portion of that was trade. You know, the ability to control trade in that region was pivotal. Why was communism so appealing? Mainly because for some it promoted the idea of classless society, and for others it was a way for them to hold their power. They could rule through fear and intimidation. I already did this one. It's the Dutch and then the British. Spheres of influence are when territories, when the Europeans carved up certain territories around the world, and they dominated the trade there. That's the idea of spheres of influence. Oh, I don't know who assassinated Patrice Lumumba. I didn't talk about that in class. We referred to him as a leader of decolonization in Congo. So I don't think you'd be asked something to that in that detail. Most of the stans are part of Central Asia. Right, Central Asia, the nomads. Lots of Islam spread through Central Asia, but the nomads. Which empires used the feudal system? Well, feudalism was predominantly tied to Europe and the Middle East, Europe and Middle Ages. It wasn't empire building. The Europeans didn't begin to conquer. That actually was before the age of exploration. Japan was able to rapidly industrialize because their government took over all the means of production, and they also got a lot of foreign assistance, lots of aid from the outside. People weren't trying to conquer Japan; they saw it as a business opportunity. I don't know what you mean by bigger, but the Taiping Rebellion killed more lives. The Boxer Rebellion both were failed uprisings. The Boxer Rebellion was against the foreign influence, and the Taiping Rebellion is, it's being anti-Jewish. Yep. Communism is anti-religion. Yes, fascism is definitely pro-religion. Yep. You're welcome, Spring with whatever that name is. The Belgians in the Congo, they used and manipulated Congolese peoples as forced labor to exploit them. It's one of the great cases of exploitation in world history. They exploited the Congolese people as forced labor to extract rubber. It's one of the horrific examples of imperialism in world history. Yeah. What was it building at the Congo? Well, number one, it's one of the largest rivers in the world, so it has easy access for trade. And then two, the rubber. That was really all about the main resource there was rubber. Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain throughout most of World War II. Oh, and then Churchill also coined the Cold War phrase, the Iron Curtain. That was Churchill. The Middle East was carved up after World War I because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And one of the most important motivating factors there was oil. The Europeans wanted access to Middle Eastern oil. Yep. Middle Eastern oil. So yeah, the Ottoman Empire, and the shame of that was that ultimately the Ottoman Empire, which many of those Arab countries were promised their freedom, their self-determination, but the Europeans did not provide that. So it's a bit of hypocrisy there, despite what everyone was talking about at the Paris Peace Conference. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So the Safavid Empire, was a gunpowder empire. The main thing with the Safavid Empire, a couple of things. I would say one, you've got it's a gunpowder empire. Two, it was in modern day Iran or Persia. And also, like, it was the start of Shia Islam. That's what I would say about the Safavids. Harpa was a city in the Neolithic era in the Indus River Valley. No, the Berlin Wall was built only in Berlin. Sure, Owen, if you want to make me a logo, that would be awesome, dude. Yeah, the British got Hong Kong, the Opium Wars. Can you get through the exam? Overarching effects and continuities, little specific details. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the context. I mean, I think one thing I always tell my students is the graders want to give you guys points, but you do have to give specific examples. So on the LEQ, I always suggest give 2 examples of each continuity change, give 2 examples of each similarity and difference. So you do need some examples. Perestroika is the economic liberation of the Soviet Union. It was the loosening of communist economy. And then a glasnost was the cultural loosening up of the Soviet Union. So welcoming in the arts and literature and films and whatnot. Wait, where is this thing? Go to that. Is there like a logo? I don't see. Oh, and can you just email it to me or something? I don't, and I want to keep answering questions, but I kind of want to check this out. Women's roles in China. We read that one of it today. Red feminism. So Chinese women were considered valuable to the economy. They were workers. They gained abortion rights, divorce rights. They were also part of Mao's Little Red Guards. So, LEQ rubric, okay? Contextualization, which is background, thesis, which is your argument or claim. And then you have 2 points for evidence. So that's 4. And I'm sorry, you get 1 point for evidence. Hold on. Context, thesis, evidence. Analysis, which is explaining one or similarity and difference. Oh, sorry, you get 2 evidence points. So to get 2 evidence points, you have to give. That's why I say give 2 examples of each. So you give 2 similarities, 2 differences. For analysis, you have to explain one example. So you have to explain 1 similarity, explain 1 difference, and then. Lastly is the complexity point, which we always talk about. That's the PSF. That's the past shapes the future. That's explaining a modern day example from a different time period, or even the past time period, and how that relates back to the question. That's how one way you get the complexity. The other way you can get complexity is if you explain both similarities and differences. That can actually get you the complexity point. Short answers should be 2 sentences per So it's 3 questions, A, B, and C. Short answers should be 2 sentences per minimum. So you should have identify sentence, explain sentence. So I would say 6 or 7 sentences. Continental system was Napoleon. Napoleon set up a system of rule throughout Europe when he was building his empire. All right, I think people are starting to log off. I'm going to be getting off in about 7 minutes here. I do not grade. I've never graded before. I've gone to the training, but I don't actually grade. Decolonization. Well, you have Algeria. I think the Algerian independence movement is one of the biggest decolonization of violences. You have other violent. You have what happened in Palestine, the Civil War. That broke out there between Palestinians and eventually the Jewish Israelis. That's an example of violence. There was sectarian violence in India, the Hindus and Muslims that broke out after the split up of India. So yeah, I mean there was most decolonization was done peacefully. There weren't wars to decolonize, but Algeria, I would say, was probably the best case example of that. Hawaiian Islands would be part of the Polynesian migrations. I would really focus on that. You know, Hawaii was part of where Polynesian peoples migrated. That's where Hawaii kind of fits in there. Any tips on how to spend the next couple of days? I did. Let me see. I'm assuming. I don't think I recognize Annabelle. I don't know where Annabelle you're from or what school you go to, but on my YouTube channel, I have, and I'll put a link up to it. I have like a tips. I did like AP tips. I did AP tips. So let me see. I'll grab that real quick. And where is? Oh, here we go. All right. So this is. Okay, Annabelle. So there you go. If you watch that, I put together like a little video. I did tips for my students out here in DC. Matthias, if you get a 5 on the AP, you should tell your parents to take you to California for vacation. What were important interactions between India, Vietnam, and Korea? Geez. Well, I mean, all were influenced in some way by China. Oh, that is Owen Meyer. That is pretty cool. Thanks, man. I don't know how you did that, but I kind of like the beard. The beard is pretty brutal. I gotta admit, it's pretty bad, but I'm letting the thing go, you know. Anyways, so yeah, Vietnam and Korea. I'd say like the influence of China in those regions is huge. The Sinification. And then India, Vietnam, really didn't. I can't really think of too many interactions there. Yes, Eric, if you get a 5 in this summer, I'll email you a CTC. I'll eat CTC while I say it. Oh, Long Island, go Mets! I'm a huge Mets fan. I'm from upstate New York. I went Albany, New York. That's where I'm from. Yes, James, I've been watching the NBA playoffs. Oh man! All right, 3 minutes. You guys, you guys are asking me some pretty funny questions now. Um, we'll see. We'll see. I will. Yeah, we'll see. I'll think about. I'll think about it. No, unfortunately, I am really tied up the next two evenings, so I don't think I can. I can do another live stream, and I think I wish that I wasn't so distracted earlier on. It was just very, very difficult there. First animal in space was Laika, the Russian dog. Yeah, Jason trying to test my dinner party knowledge there. Yeah, Laika, the Russians sent the dog. The dog died too, sadly, in space. And then the Americans sent a monkey into space. That was the first animal. Yeah, the monkey survived. Yeah. The Europeans, well, the biggest technology the Europeans had, I think, when they conquered the Indian Ocean. You guys read that article about that? They had superior weaponry. That was huge. Their cannons and their guns were just far superior than what the natives and the indigenous peoples of South Asia had. So, and then also the European ships, they were smaller and quicker. And so they were more maneuverable than a lot of the ships that were in the Indian Ocean. Oh my God, my favorite history fact. Holy smokes. Boy, I'd have to really think about that. I'd have to really think about that, Millette. I don't know what my favorite fact is. Boy. My favorite American politician is Daniel Webster, but I don't. Fact. I'll have to think that one. Okay, well, oh man, my favorite dinner party knowledge fact. God, you guys are killing me on this. Yeah, I don't know. That's such a good question. I really like. I have a lot of like weird knowledge about like about I would like space and this I don't know, a lot of weird sports dinner party knowledge too. But I don't know. You guys are putting me on the spot now. I feel like yes, James the Indicator. Now I feel like I you guys in class. All right. Well, listen, above my, I've been over 2.5 hours here, so I got to go, and I appreciate everyone coming in. I'm shutting the chat off here, and I'm shutting this thing down. I guess it's fitting here with past shapes the future. In off hours at 7:40. 7:40 is our tutoring tomorrow. So yeah, come on in at 7:40. All right, everyone, take it easy. Good night.